She's just a waitress. Why is he letting her touch his son? The whispers cut through the quiet elegance of Morel at Hanover Park like glass on porcelain. Edward Langston, CEO of Langston Holdings, a man who negotiates billion-dollar deals from the 61st floor of Langston Tower, sat frozen in his chair, not from power, but from disbelief. His 8-year-old son, Jalen, who hadn't spoken a single word in 2 years, was now eating. Not just eating from the hands of a black waitress. Her hands bore no diamonds, no visainer bracelets, just faint trembles and the calluses of someone who's worked too hard for too long. Yet every movement she made, every glance, every breath, matched the quiet rhythm of the boy beside her. Edward didn't know who she was, but he was about to learn something devastating. That same pair of hands belonged to the woman his company defunded 5 years ago. And now, she was holding the one thing his wealth had failed to reach, his son's trust. He commanded billion-dollar mergers with a single phone call, but couldn't get his own son to take a single bite. Edward Langston sat stiffly in his custom-tailored suit, watching his 8-year-old son, Jalen, rock back and forth in the velvet-lined booth of Morel at Hanover Park. The boy's untouched $200 lobster dish grew cold, while other patrons glanced over with subtle judgment. Edward's jaw tightened with each whisper, each sideways look. "Jalen, please," he said under his breath, tense and sharp. "People are watching. Before we go any further, hit the like button if you've ever felt unseen while carrying the weight of the world. Because this story, it's not just about autism. It's about love, regret, and the courage to truly see people for who they are." But then, something extraordinary happened. A black waitress approached their table with movements so gentle they felt choreographed by angels. Without saying a word, she knelt beside Jalen's chair and began to hum a soft melody. What Edward didn't yet realize was, she wasn't just any waitress. She was about to teach him something no $500 an hour specialist ever could. Within 3 minutes, the boy who hadn't spoken in 2 years was eating from her hands. Edward stared in stunned silence. Who was this woman, and how had she just done what a dozen elite specialists couldn't? 3 days earlier, the elevator climbed 60 stories in dead silence. Edward Langston, CEO of Langston Holdings, stood motionless in his sky-high corner office, the sprawling city of Ridgeport unfolding beneath him like a chessboard he controlled. His empire stretched across healthcare, education, and advanced technology. Industries that touched millions of lives, yet the one life that mattered most remained out of reach. A soft knock. "Mr. Langston, the car's ready for your dinner with Jalen," said Liam Reyes, his assistant. Edward closed his eyes. Another father-son dinner. Another evening of sitting across from a child he couldn't reach, couldn't comfort, couldn't understand. Across town, in the cramped break room of Morel at Hanover Park, Savannah Brooks tied her apron with practiced precision. At 32, she moved like someone who had learned to carry burdens without complaint. The calluses on her hands spoke of long double shifts, but her eyes held something money couldn't buy, a quiet depth shaped by years of loving the overlooked. She checked herself in the cracked mirror. 10 years ago, those same hands had guided dozens of special needs children through breakthrough moments. 10 years ago, she believed education could transform the world. Now, she carried plates instead, and swallowed pride one shift at a time. Meanwhile, 8-year-old Jalen Morris sat quietly in the back seat of a black Mercedes. His small fingers traced invisible shapes on the tinted window. Outside, the Ridgeport skyline blurred past like unreachable stars. He lived in a mansion with 17 rooms, and spent most of his time in just one, his bedroom, where the lights didn't flicker and the sounds didn't sting. The evening began predictably. Edward and Jalen sat at their usual corner booth. The boy immediately covered his ears at the sound of the restaurant's soft jazz piano. Edward ordered for them both, his voice clipped, accustomed to being obeyed. "The usual for the child," he told Savannah without looking up from his phone. "And make sure it's not too hot. He's particular." Savannah nodded, but her trained eyes were already locked on the boy. She recognized the signs instantly: sensory overload, withdrawal inward. His small body curled inward like a question mark looking for an answer. When the food arrived, the familiar ritual began. Edward coaxed, bargained, threatened, softly. Jalen rocked and hummed, lost in his private world. Other diners stared, whispered, judged, and then Savannah did something no one expected. She knelt beside Jalen's chair, not towering over him like every adult in his life, but lowering herself to his eye level. She began to hum, a melody so soft, it felt like a lullaby wrapped in starlight. It was Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, but gently rearranged in minor keys, syncing perfectly with the rhythm of Jalen's rocking. The boy's hands slowly stilled, and his eyes, usually darting anywhere but toward faces, found hers. Without stopping the melody, Savannah picked up a small piece of lobster and traced it in a slow circle, mimicking the same shape Jalen had been drawing on the table. She made the food dance. She turned dinner into a quiet ballet. Just for him. Jalen leaned forward. Then, miracle of miracles, he opened his mouth. Edward watched, breath held, as his son took bite after bite. For the first time in months, the small boy's body began to relax. He didn't say thank you, but the look in his eyes said something was finally beginning. 10 years earlier, Savannah had stood before a classroom of 15 special needs children, her heart brimming with purpose. The Bridgeview Center for Learning was her sanctuary, a space where different minds weren't problems to fix, but gifts to unwrap. Remember, she once told her aide, they're not broken, they just speak a different language. Our job is to learn it. 8-year-old Jalen Morris, son of a billionaire, would have thrived here, but Savannah hadn't known him then. She only knew that love and patience could unlock any door. 5 years ago, Edward Langston sat at the head of a long mahogany boardroom table, flipping through quarterly reports with surgical precision. The education division was underperforming. Cut the special needs programs, he instructed coolly. They're not cost-effective. Refocus our resources on mainstream initiatives. He signed the order without blinking, with the same hand that would later struggle to get his own son to swallow a bite of food. The irony was lost on him. 2 years ago, the diagnosis came. Edward sat across from Dr. Alma Jennings at East Harbor Pediatric Institute, the phrase autism spectrum disorder echoing in the sterile room like a sentence. He'll need specialized care. The doctor said gently, there are excellent programs, though unfortunately, many have lost funding in recent years. Edward barely heard the rest. In the silence of that moment, his empire felt like it was collapsing inward, not with noise, but with the deafening weight of his son's silence. In the weeks that followed, Edward began requesting Savannah's section each time he took Jalen to dinner at Morel. The boy, who couldn't sit still for 5 minutes at home, would spend entire hours peacefully eating under Savannah's quiet guidance. She began teaching Edward small things: how to dim his phone screen so the flickering wouldn't distract, how to speak in lower tones, how to approach Jalen from the side, never head-on. Each tip felt like a fragment of a new language, one his money had never been able to buy. You're good with him, Edward admitted one evening. His usual businesslike tone softened with something vulnerable. Where did you learn? Practice, Savannah replied simply, refilling his water glass. But there was something in her voice, something that said there was far more to that answer than she let on. Edward began showing up early, staying later. Other diners complained about the disruption caused by Jalen's presence, but Savannah always arranged for them to sit in the restaurant's quietest corner. She carved out a sanctuary, a bubble of calm within the chaos, just for one boy. And then, the complications began. Restaurant management started asking questions. Why was their most highly requested waitress spending so much time with just one table? Then came the tabloids. The media caught wind of the billionaire CEO's special friendship with a server. The headlines were cruel. Langston's waitress whisperer, when money can't buy parenting. But the real threat came from somewhere Edward hadn't expected. Clarice Morris, Edward's ex-wife and Jalen's estranged mother, read the tabloid stories from her penthouse in southern France. She had left 2 years earlier, disappearing when Jalen's diagnosis made their picture-perfect family life inconvenient. Now she saw an opportunity. Says here he's developed an inappropriate relationship with service staff. She told her lawyer, swirling champagne, "This is clearly an unstable environment for our son. I want custody." The night everything changed began like any other. Savannah approached their table with her usual gentle grace, but Edward noticed it immediately. Her step was heavier, her eyes shadowed. Still, she moved with the same soft rhythm as always, guiding Jalen through his meal with quiet care. Then something unprecedented happened. Jalen reached out and touched her hand, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the first words he'd spoken in 2 years. "Mama Savannah, hungry." The words floated through the air like a prayer finally answered. Savannah's eyes welled with tears. She didn't try to hide. Edward felt something crack open inside him, a wall he'd built so high for so long. He had forgotten what lay behind it. "She's not just hungry," Edward said quietly, voice rough with realization. "She's been taking care of everyone but herself." For the first time, they truly saw each other. Not billionaire and waitress, not powerful and powerless, not white and black, just two people, bound by love for the same remarkable child. "Tell me about yourself," Edward said, and for once it wasn't a command, it was a plea. The custody papers arrived the following Tuesday. Along with them, paparazzi photos of Edward, Savannah, and Jalen sharing what looked like an intimate family dinner. Clarice's legal team went on the offensive. They painted a portrait of chaos, a CEO who outsourced parenting to restaurant staff, an unstable home environment, questionable boundaries with hired help. The hearing was scheduled for the next week. But Edward wasn't just walking into a custody battle. He was about to confront the price of a system he himself had broken. His lawyers were polished, his strategy airtight, but his lead attorney pulled him aside before court. "They'll make this about race and class," he warned. "They'll say you're exploiting this woman, that you're using her as unpaid childcare. You need to distance yourself." But Edward couldn't. He wouldn't. Not from the woman who had given him his son back. The media frenzy was relentless. Reporters camped outside Morel at Hanover Park, turning Savannah's workplace into a fishbowl. The restaurant placed her on unpaid leave in an attempt to manage the scandal. And for the first time in years, Edward couldn't sleep. Worse, Jalen could sense the shift. The boy began to shut down again. Without Savannah's calming presence, he stopped eating. Just like before. On the morning of the hearing, Edward made a decision that would alter everything. He called her. "I need you to testify," he said. "I need you to tell them who you really are." The courtroom was packed. Reporters, onlookers, whispering voices. Clarice sat front and center in a tailored designer suit, her expression cold and composed. Next to her, Savannah sat quietly in a simple black dress, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Margaret's attorney wasted no time. They painted Savannah as a manipulative opportunist, a woman who had used a vulnerable child to secure her place in the life of a powerful man. It was calculated, cruel, intended to humiliate. Then it was Savannah's turn. She walked slowly to the stand. Every camera flashed a bolt of lightning, but her hands were steady. "Tell us about your relationship with the defendant and his son," the opposing lawyer demanded. Savannah looked at Edward, then at Jalen sitting quietly in the gallery, then back to the crowd of strangers who had already decided what kind of woman she must be. "My name is Savannah Brooks," she began. Her voice was quiet at first, but with each word, it grew stronger. "I have a master's degree in special education from Columbia University. For 8 years, I ran the Bridgeview Center for Learning, where I helped more than 200 children with autism, ADHD, and developmental delays. Children like Jalen learn to speak, to trust, to believe in themselves." The room fell silent. "I lost that job when our program lost its funding," she said. The company that pulled that funding was Langston Holdings. Savannah paused, her eyes unwavering. Mr. Langston's company shut down the very programs his son would later need, the same services I dedicated my life to providing. Edward felt the color drain from his face. So yes, Savannah continued, her voice ringing with calm, quiet power, I know how to help Jalen eat. I know how to make him feel safe, because I spent 8 years learning that children like Jalen aren't broken. They're just ignored. She turned, looking directly at Clarice, and when the world stopped paying me to love them, I kept loving them anyway. One table, one shift, one moment at a time. Her eyes didn't waver. You want to know why Jalen calls me Mama Savannah? She paused, letting the silence deepen. Because I'm the first person in his life who saw him as a gift, not a burden. Not because I was paid to, but because that's what real love looks like. If this part touched you, consider subscribing. These are the stories we don't see enough, the ones where dignity wins and love rewrites the rules. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to get quotes. Clarice's perfect composure finally cracked. But Edward heard only one thing, the sound of his own heart breaking open. The judge's ruling was swift and clear. Jalen would remain in his father's custody, but with conditions: mandatory family therapy, professional autism support services, and a comprehensive care plan built by licensed specialists. Outside the courthouse, Edward found Savannah sitting alone on the courthouse steps, her body slumped with emotional exhaustion. He sat beside her, the knees of his $1,000 suit wrinkling against the stone. I'm sorry, he said. The words felt small compared to the weight behind them. I'm sorry for what my company did. I'm sorry for what I took from you, from all those children. And I'm sorry it took losing my own son's trust to understand what I helped destroy. For a man who once signed away lives with a pen stroke. This apology held the weight of 1,000 regrets. Savannah looked at him, this man who had unknowingly shaped her fate. Your apology doesn't give me back 8 years, she said quietly, but it's a start. Edward didn't flinch. I want to hire you, he said, not as a waitress, as director of the new Langston Foundation for Neurodevelopment. He looked her straight in the eye. Full control, unlimited budget. Your vision. Savannah studied his face carefully, searching for condescension, for pity. She found neither. Why? She asked. Because Jalen's not the only child like him, Edward said, and you're not the only one like you. The world needs what you have to give. That evening, in the quiet of Edward's penthouse, something extraordinary happened. Savannah prepared Jalen's dinner, her movements soft, patient, just as they'd always been. But this time, Edward watched, and he learned. He hummed the lullabies. He spoke gently. He moved slowly, like her. Jalen ate from both their hands. His little body softened, trusted. For the first time since his diagnosis, he looked less like a broken puzzle piece, and more like what he truly was, a beautiful soul, speaking his own language. Edward felt tears roll down his cheeks, the first he'd shed since his divorce. You brought me back to my heart, he whispered. Savannah reached across the table, her hand finding his. No, she said softly. You just finally learned to listen.